Leo did not like hallways. In fact, he actively avoided them whenever he could. To most people at Northwood High, the long corridors between classrooms were just a path to get from math to history. To Leo, they felt like a gauntlet. The walls were painted a bright, cheerful yellow that was supposed to make students feel energetic. But it only made him feel exposed. The floor was linoleum, checked with white and gray. And every squeak of his sneaker seemed to echo like a shout, announcing exactly where he was. He kept his head down. This was his usual strategy. If he looked at the floor, he didn't have to catch anyone's eye. He didn't have to say hello or deal with the awkward silence when someone didn't say hello back. He just focused on the scuff marks on his shoes and kept moving. Today was a Tuesday, which meant it was a long day. Leo had his backpack slung over one shoulder, the weight of it pulling his sweater slightly off to the side. He wore sweaters a lot, even when the weather was starting to get warm. They were like a uniform for him. They were comfortable, and most importantly, they were big. He could pull the sleeves down over his hands if he needed to hide his fidgeting fingers. Today's sweater was a dark green color, faded from too many washes. He had found it at a thrift store for $3, which was exactly the kind of price he liked. While he walked, he heard the noise level rise as he got closer to the cafeteria. This was the danger zone. This was where the groups gathered. There were the athletes by the windows, their laughter booming and confident. There were the popular kids dressed in clothes that looked brand new, checking their phones and talking loudly about weekend plans. Then there were everyone else, scattered in between. Leo tried to speed up. He wanted to turn left at the junction and head toward the B wing, where the lockers were quieter. But as he turned the corner, he bumped into someone. It wasn't a hard crash, just a clumsy brush of shoulders. "Watch it," a voice said. It wasn't mean, just annoyed. "Sorry," Leo mumbled. He didn't even look up to see who it was. He just tightened his grip on the strap of his bag and kept walking. His face felt hot, a familiar prickly feeling of embarrassment washing over him, even though nothing really happened. He hated feeling like he was in the way. He finally made it to the B wing and took a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper, which was actually a comforting smell for him. It was the smell of school, but without the pressure of people. He walked past rows of metal lockers, some decorated with magnets and photos, others scratched and dented. He stopped at locker 142. It was his. He spun the combination lock. Left, right, left. It clicked open. He shoved his bag inside and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He looked around to make sure no one was watching closely. Seeing the coast was clear, he unfolded the paper carefully. It was sheet music. The paper was old and yellowed at the edges. It had been photocopied so many times that the notes were slightly fuzzy in places, but Leo knew every single one of them by heart. It was a piece by Chopin. He had been working on it for 3 months. To anyone else, it was just dots and lines on a page, squiggles that made no sense. But to Leo, it was a map. It was a place he could go where everything made sense. He didn't play sports. He wasn't on the debate team. He wasn't smart enough to be in the advanced placement classes, and he wasn't outgoing enough to be in student government. Most teachers didn't even know his name. They just saw a quiet kid who sat in the back and turned his homework in on time. If they thought of him at all, they probably thought he was just drifting through his senior year, waiting for it to be over. But they didn't know about the music. Leo looked down the hall toward the music room. It was at the very end of the building, far away from the main office and the gym. It was a sanctuary. During lunch hour, when most kids were eating or gossiping outside, Leo would sneak down there. He didn't have a pass, and technically he wasn't supposed to be in there without a teacher. But Mr. Henderson, the music teacher, didn't mind Mr. Henderson, was an older man with gray hair and glasses that were always sliding down his nose. He usually spent his lunch hour eating a sandwich in his office and listening to the radio. He had seen Leo hanging around the hallway a few weeks ago, and instead of yelling at him to go to the cafeteria, he had tossed him a key. For the upright, Mr. Henderson had said, "Just don't break the strings, and keep the volume down on the loud parts." Leo still treasured that key. He kept it on a small ring attached to his zipper pull. It was the only key he had, that gave him access to something he loved. He refolded the paper and put it into his back pocket. He had 15 minutes before the bell rang. That was enough time. He didn't need to play the whole song. He just needed to play a little bit. It was the only thing that settled his mind as he walked toward the music room. The noise of the school faded away. Here, the classrooms were mostly empty storage rooms or art studios. It was peaceful. He reached the door of the music room. It was made of glass and metal, not wood, and he could see the dusty light filtering in through the high windows. He didn't open it yet. He just stood there for a moment, listening. There was no piano sound yet, just the hum of the ventilation system. He pushed the handle down and slipped inside. The room smelled like rosin and dust, a very specific smell that Leo loved. There were instruments stacked in corner strumpets in cases, drums in piles, and a big cello rack against the wall. But Leo only had eyes for the upright piano in the corner. It wasn't a grand piano. It wasn't shiny or black. It was a brown, boxy thing that had seen better days. Some of the keys had little chips in the ivory, and if you played the low C too hard, it made a buzzing sound. But to Leo, it was perfect. He walked over to the bench and sat down. The bench was hard and had a crack in the vinyl seat, but Leo didn't mind. He pulled out the folded music paper and placed it on the rack. He didn't really need to look at it, but having it there made him feel secure. He hovered his hands over the keys. They were clean hands, nails cut short. They looked a little pale against the off-white keys. He took a breath, filling his lungs, and then let it out slowly. He pressed down on the first chord. The sound wasn't perfect. The room was too dry, and the piano was a little out of tune. But the vibration traveled up his fingers, into his wrists, and settled in his chest. It was like a physical weight being lifted. He played the introduction, a slow, rolling melody that climbed up the scale. For those few minutes, Leo wasn't the invisible kid in the green sweater. He wasn't the student who got bumped in the hallway. He was someone else entirely. He was in control. Every note was a decision he made. If he wanted it loud, it was loud. If he wanted it soft, it was soft. There were no bullies here, no awkward silences, no expectations he couldn't meet. There was only the music. He closed his eyes as he moved into the more difficult part of the passage. His fingers stumbled once on a tricky transition, hitting two notes at once instead of one. He stopped immediately, frowning. No, he whispered to himself. He didn't get frustrated like he did with math homework. He just went back to the measure and played it again. Slower this time. 1, 2, 3, 4. He isolated the problem. He moved his thumb a fraction of an inch to the left. He tried again. This time, it was smooth. A perfect run of notes. A small smile touched his lips. It was a tiny smile, barely there, but it was genuine. It was the satisfaction of solving a puzzle, of fixing something that was broken. Outside in the hallway, a bell rang. The sound was shrill and cut through the quiet of the music room like a knife. Leo's hands froze. The spell was broken. He quickly pulled his hands back from the keys as if they had been burned. The silence rushed back in, heavy and loud. He looked at the clock on the wall. Lunch was over. The students would be flooding the hallways soon. He had to get to English class. He carefully took the sheet music off the rack, folded it along the same creases he always used, and slid it into his pocket. He stood up and wiped his hands on his sweater, even though they weren't sweaty. It was just a habit, a way of wiping away the music so he could go back to being regular. Leo again. He walked to the door and looked out the small glass window. He could see a group of students walking past, laughing and shoving each other. He waited for them to pass. He didn't want to walk out right in the middle of them. He counted to 10, pushed the door open, and slipped out into the hallway. Merging into the flow of people like a drop of water returning to a river, he kept his head down. He pulled his sleeves over his hands. He walked toward his next class, the echo of the piano still ringing softly in his ears. A secret he carried hidden under the faded green fabric of his sweater. The atmosphere in the school had shifted drastically over the last week. The usual focus on grades and sports was replaced by a single buzzing topic, the annual talent showcase. It was the biggest event of the spring semester, bigger than the homecoming game for some kids. Posters covered every available wall space on the bulletin boards, featuring bright colors and bold fonts announcing the date. The main hallway, usually a place of rushed footsteps and lowered heads, was now filled with excited chatter about who was signing up and what they were going to do. Leo watched the buzz from a distance. Leaning against the lockers while tying his shoe just to have an excuse to stop moving, he saw a group of girls laughing as they filled out a registration form for a dance routine. He saw two guys arguing over who was going to sing the high note in a rock song they were planning to perform. Everyone seemed to have a place in this event, except for him. Or at least, that's what he told himself. For 3 days, Leo had walked past the sign-up table, set up outside the auditorium. It was a simple folding table, covered with a blue cloth, manned by Mrs. Gable, the drama teacher. She sat there with a box of forms and a pen, encouraging every student who walked by to sign up. Every time Leo passed her, he felt a tug in his stomach. He wanted to sign up. He wanted to play the chop and piece on that list. But the fear that always sat on his shoulder held him back. "You're not a performer," the voice in his head said. Asterisk, "You're the kid who sits in the back. Don't embarrass yourself." Asterisk, on Thursday afternoon, the hallway was surprisingly clear. The final bell had rung a few minutes ago, and most kids were eager to get outside or to the gym. Leo found himself standing in front of the registration table. Mrs. Gable was organizing a stack of papers. He took a deep breath and walked up. His legs felt heavy, like he was walking through deep water. "Hi, Leo," Mrs. Gable said, looking up over her glasses. She smiled warmly. She was one of the few teachers who actually knew his name without looking at a roster. "Are you here to sign up? Or just admiring the view?" Leo cleared his throat. He felt his face getting hot. "What?" "I was thinking about signing up," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Gable said, handing him a clipboard and a pen. "We need all kinds of acts. What are you going to do? Magic? Comedy? Piano," Leo said. He took the clipboard. The paper had lines for name, act, type, and song title. He wrote Leo in messy letters. Under act type, he wrote classical piano. But the song title, he hesitated. He knew it was a difficult piece. He wrote Nocturne in E-flat major. Just writing it down made his heart beat faster. "A piano player," Mrs. Gable said, sounding genuinely impressed. "That's lovely, Leo. We haven't had a piano solo in years. This will be a nice change from all the loud pop music." Leo nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He handed the clipboard back to her. She looked it over, nodded in approval, and tore off the bottom carbon copy for him to keep. "Good luck with the practice," she said. "See you on stage." Leo took the slip of paper. He had actually done it. He felt a strange mix of terror and relief. He turned to leave, his hand tightening around the paper. But as he turned the corner to head toward the exit, he ran into a wall of authority. Principal Holloway was walking down the hallway, checking doors to make sure they were locked. He was a tall man with a broad chest and a walk that commanded attention. He wore a suit that looked like it cost more than Leo's entire wardrobe, and he always carried a clipboard with him. As if he was grading the school itself, Leo stepped aside quickly to let him pass, keeping his head down. He tried to tuck the registration slip into his pocket, hoping the principal hadn't seen it. "Whoa, slow down there," Principal Holloway said. He stopped. He had sharp eyes that missed very little. He looked down at Leo, then his gaze drifted to the piece of paper in Leo's hand. "What's that you've got there?" "It's nothing, sir," Leo mumbled, trying to hide it behind his back. "Didn't look like nothing," the principal said. He reached out a hand, palm up. "Let me see." Leo froze. He couldn't say no to the principal. His hand shook a little as he held out the slip of paper. Principal Holloway took it. He adjusted his glasses and held the paper up to read it. He was silent for a moment. Leo stood there, wishing he could disappear. "Leo Wright?" the principal asked, finally looking at him. "Yes, sir. Piano?" Principal Holloway let out a short, dry laugh. He lowered the paper and looked at Leo with a look of confusion and mild amusement. "This is a joke, right?" "No, sir," Leo said quietly. He stared at the principal's tie. It was blue with small geometric patterns. "I want to play." The principal didn't seem angry. He just sounded perplexed, like someone trying to understand a foreign language. He looked around the hallway to make sure no one was listening, then stepped closer to Leo. He lowered his voice, but not enough to make it a whisper. "Leo," Calloway said, his tone shifting to something that sounded like helpful advice but felt like a dismissal. "This showcase is a big deal. We have the superintendent coming. We have parents coming. We need to put on a show. People want to see excitement. They want to see talent they can clap for." "I can play," Leo insisted, his voice shaking a little harder now. "I've been practicing." "I'm sure you've been plinking away in the music room," the principal said, waving his hand dismissively. "But this isn't music class. This is a performance. You're a quiet kid, Leo. You keep to yourself. You think you can get up in front of 500 people and keep them interested with classical music? They're going to be bored. They're going to start talking, and then you'll be standing there looking foolish." Leo felt a sting in his eyes, but he refused to let them tear up. He gripped the strap of his backpack until his knuckles turned white. He had heard this before. He heard it every time someone looked at his sweaters or his old shoes. They saw what he looked like on the outside and assumed they knew what was on the inside. "Should really think about stepping down," Principal Holloway continued. He handed the paper back to Leo. "Leave the stage to the kids who have a personality for it. Save yourself the embarrassment. It's brave to sign up, but it's smarter to know when you're out of your depth." There was a group of freshman girls walking by then. They were giggling about something, and as they passed, Principal Holloway gave them a polite nod. They didn't notice Leo standing there. To them, he was just furniture. The principal's words cut deeper than any insult from a student could. This wasn't a bully picking on him for being different. This was the person in charge telling him that his different wasn't good enough. "I'll be fine," Leo said. It was the first time he had interrupted an adult in a long time. It surprised him just as much as it surprised the principal. Holloway raised an eyebrow. He looked at Leo for a long moment, sizing him up. He didn't look angry, just skeptical. He shook his head slowly. "All right. If you want to go through with it, that's your choice. But don't say I didn't warn you. Just don't freeze up there, Leo. It's a bad look for the school." He turned and walked away, his shoes squeaking rhythmically on the floor as he continued checking doors. Leo stood there for a long time. The hallway was empty now. He looked down at the slip of paper in his hand. It was slightly crumpled where the principal had held it. The words "classical piano" looked small and insignificant. Part of him wanted to go back to Mrs. Gable and tell her he made a mistake. He wanted to tear the paper up and throw it in the trash can by the water fountain. Principal Holloway's voice was echoing in his head. "Save yourself the embarrassment. You're out of your depth. You're going to be bored." He walked over to the trash can. He held the paper over the opening. It would be so easy. He could go back to being invisible. He could go back to the music room and play only for himself, where no one could judge him and no one could tell him he wasn't enough. He looked at the paper. He remembered the feeling of his fingers on the keys. He remembered the sound of the C major chord, the way it filled the empty room. He remembered the tiny smile he had given himself when he played the difficult part perfectly. Leo lowered his hand. He folded the paper carefully, smoothing out the crease the principal had made. He put it deep into his wallet, zipping it into the compartment where he kept his lunch money. He adjusted his backpack and turned toward the exit. He walked out of the school and into the afternoon sun. He was scared. He was more scared than he had ever been in his life. But he wasn't going to quit. The night of the talent showcase arrived faster than Leo had anticipated. One moment he was agonizing over the registration form, and the next, he was standing in the cramped, dimly lit wings of the auditorium, listening to the dull roar of a crowd settling into their seats. The air backstage smelled of hairspray, floor wax, and the sharp metallic scent of nervous sweat. It was a chaotic scene. Students in glittery costumes were rushing back and forth. Teachers were shouting last-minute instructions, and stagehands were coiling thick black cables like snakes. Leo stood in his corner, trying to make himself as small as possible. He was still wearing his usual clothes, the dark green sweater, and clean gray trousers. It was the nicest outfit he owned, but looking around at the sequins and dresses, he felt painfully plain. He clutched his folder of sheet music against his chest, the plastic cover feeling slippery under his damp palms. "You're on after the break?" a girl with a microphone headset said as she zoomed past him. She didn't even stop to see if he heard her. Leo swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, like he had swallowed a piece of dry bread. He peeked around the heavy velvet curtain that separated the backstage area from the stage. The auditorium was packed. The rows of seats were filled with parents holding flowers, students holding posters, and teachers looking on with pride. In the very center of the front row sat Principal Holloway. He was speaking to the superintendent, gesturing with his hands, looking relaxed and confident. He didn't look nervous at all. Why would he? He wasn't the one about to risk public humiliation. On stage, a rock band was finishing their set. They were loud and energetic, the guitarist jumping around as he played a screeching solo. The crowd loved it. The noise was almost physical, pushing against Leo's chest. He watched them and felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. This is what they want, he thought. Energy, noise, movement. He looked down at his own folder, containing a slow, quiet, 100-year-old piece of music. It felt completely out of place. The song ended with a crash of cymbals. The audience erupted into cheers and applause. It was deafening. Leo flinched slightly and pulled back behind the curtain. The band members ran off stage, high-fiving each other, breathless and grinning. They were buzzing with adrenaline. As they passed, one of them bumped into Leo's shoulder. "Good luck." "Man," the guitarist said, though he was looking past Leo. "Already searching for a water bottle?" "Thanks," Leo whispered to the empty air. The lights on stage dimmed. Mrs. Gable walked out to the center microphone to introduce the next act. It was a girl named Jenny who was going to sing a pop ballad. Leo listened as he waited his turn. Jenny had a powerful voice, and the crowd clapped along. It felt safe. It was what everyone expected. Leo's mind started to race. He thought about Principal Holloway's voice in the hallway. Asterisk, you're going to freeze up. Asterisk, they're going to be bored. The words had been looping in his head for days. But now, standing here with the bright lights, just a few feet away, they felt less like warnings and more like prophecies. He looked at the emergency exit sign glowing red at the far end of the backstage hallway. It would be so easy to walk out that door. He could just go home. He could say he felt sick. No one would really blame him. They would probably just forget about it by next week. He took a step toward the exit. His sneakers squeaked on the concrete floor. He stopped. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. But then he remembered the feeling of the piano keys. He remembered the quiet afternoon in the music room, the sun hitting the dust motes, the perfect sound of the chord. He remembered the way the music made him feel like he was floating, like he was speaking a language he actually understood. If he left now, he wasn't just quitting a show. He was agreeing with Holloway. He was agreeing that he was nobody, that he was the quiet kid who should stay in the background. Jenny finished her song to a loud round of applause. The clapping died down, and the stage went black for a moment. The silence that followed was heavy. This was it. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Gable's voice echoed through the speakers. Our next performer is a senior who has prepared a very special piece for us tonight. Please welcome Leo Valdez to the piano. The name felt strange to hear announced over the loudspeaker. There was a polite smattering of applause. It wasn't the wild cheering the rock band got. It was the nice-to-see-you applause, the kind of sound people make when they are being polite but waiting for the next big thing. Leo heard a few whispers from the front row. He saw Principal Holloway lean back in his seat, checking his watch. Holloway didn't look at the stage. He looked at his wrist, clearly expecting this to be the boring part of the evening. Leo took a deep breath. He felt like his heart was going to beat right out of his chest. He stepped out from behind the curtain. The transition from the dark wings to the bright stage lights was blinding. For a second, Leo couldn't see the audience at all. He just saw a wall of white light. He blinked rapidly, trying to adjust. The heat from the stage lights hit his face immediately, making the sweater feel much hotter than before. He walked toward the piano, the sound of his footsteps amplified by the floor. He reached the bench. It was a grand piano, shiny and black, much larger than the upright he practiced on. It looked intimidating, like a sleeping beast. He sat down. The seat was slippery. He adjusted the distance, pulling it forward a bit, just like he liked it. He placed his folder on the music rack. He didn't open it yet. He just sat there, looking at the keys. They were pristine, white and black, reflecting the stage lights. In the silence of the auditorium, every tiny sound seemed magnified. He could hear someone coughing in the third row. He could hear the rustle of a candy wrapper. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and fast. He looked up, trying to find a friendly face. The lights made it hard to see past the first few rows, but he could make out shapes. He saw the superintendent looking bored. He saw the students in the front, some of them whispering to each other, checking their phones. They looked restless. They wanted the energy back. Leo's stomach turned over. Principal Holloway's words came back to him again, sharper this time. Asterisk, they're going to be bored. They already were bored. He hadn't even played a note yet. He felt the urge to run swell up in his legs. He felt the weight of every insecurity he had ever had, pressing down on his shoulders. Who was he to think he could do this? He was just a kid in a thrift store sweater. He reached out and hovered his hands over the keys. He hesitated. The silence stretched on. It felt like it had been minutes, though it was probably only 5 seconds. He saw someone in the front row shift in their seat, the sound of the fabric scraping loud in the quiet. He closed his eyes. He blocked out the lights. He blocked out the principal checking his watch. He blocked out the whispering students. He imagined he was back in the empty music room. Just him and the vibrations. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to play the music. He owed it to the music to play it right. Leo opened his eyes. He focused entirely on the black and white pattern in front of him. He took a deep, shaky breath, held it for a second, and then let it go. He pressed down the keys. The first chord rang out, clear and deep, cutting through the restless murmur of the room like a knife. It wasn't just a sound. It was a statement. The subtle rustling of candy wrappers and the hushed conversations in the back row didn't stop instantly. But they were suddenly drowned out by the sheer weight of the note. It hung in the air for a long moment, vibrating against the high ceiling of the auditorium. Leo didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the room to settle. He knew that if he stopped, the fear would catch up to him. So he kept moving. His right hand drifted up the keyboard, playing the introductory melody. It was simple at first, lonely and questioning. It was the sound of someone standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the water below. For the first 10 seconds, the audience remained in their distracted state. Students in the back rows were still checking their phones under the dimmed lights. A few teachers were whispering to one another about the upcoming weekend. The principal in the front row was still looking at his wrist, tapping his foot impatiently, waiting for the polite clapping to begin so the night could move on. But then the music changed. Leo moved into the second section of the piece. His fingers, which had been stiff and trembling just moments ago, seemed to suddenly remember exactly what to do. He pressed down harder, using the weight of his arms to drive the hammers into the strings. The sound swelled. It was no longer soft. It was aggressive and demanding. A few heads near the front began to turn. The girl who had been checking her phone stopped scrolling and looked up. The whispers in the back died down, replaced by a confused silence. People realized that this wasn't the clumsy, halting performance they had expected. The boy in the oversized sweater wasn't pecking at the keys. He was attacking them. Principal Holloway paused, his foot tapping. He looked up from his watch, expecting to see the boy struggling, or maybe stopping to apologize for a mistake. Instead, he saw Leo leaning forward, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The principal raised his eyebrows, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. He sat up a little straighter in his seat, his attention finally drawn away from his schedule and toward the stage. Leo was no longer in the auditorium. As his hands flew across the ivory, the bright lights and the hundreds of eyes disappeared. In his mind, he was back in the quiet safety of the music room, but the sound was bigger now. It was filling every empty space inside him. He wasn't thinking about the notes or the timing anymore. He was thinking about the feelings the music represented. He thought about the hallways where he felt invisible. He thought about the days where he felt like he was walking through a fog. All that loneliness, all that quiet frustration, was pouring out of his fingertips and turning into something beautiful. The piece reached a chaotic, fast-paced section. Leo's left hand was jumping up and down the bass keys, creating a driving rhythm, while his right hand played complicated runs that sounded like a waterfall. His face, usually hidden and blank, was alive now. His eyes were closed tight, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked intense, almost fierce. It was a side of him no one at school had ever seen. In the third row, a group of varsity athletes, usually the ones who made the most noise, were sitting in complete silence. They weren't whispering or laughing. They were just watching. It wasn't just that the music was good. It was that it was captivating. It had a raw energy that you couldn't ignore. It didn't feel like a recital. It felt like a story being told without words. Mrs. Gable stood in the wings, her arms crossed over her clipboard, smiling broadly. She had seen the potential in him, but even she was surprised by the power he was projecting. She watched the audience and saw the transformation happening. The skepticism was evaporating, replaced by a rapt attention. The music shifted again, transitioning from the stormy, fast pace into a slow, haunting melody. The notes were soft now, delicate and fragile. The auditorium was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning humming. Leo played a series of high, tinkling notes that sounded like tears hitting the ground. He bent his head low over the keys, pouring every ounce of his vulnerability into the sound. It was heartbreaking and lovely all at once. This was the part where most people would get bored. It was slow. It didn't have a beat you could tap your foot to, but no one moved. No one checked their phones. The entire room was holding its collective breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the spell would break. The music had reached past their defenses and touched something personal in everyone. Listening Principal Holloway had completely forgotten about his watch. He was staring at the stage, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the boy on the bench, the boy he had told to quit, the boy he had labeled as boring, the boy he had dismissed. He watched the way Leo's hands moved, confident and sure. The principal felt a strange, sinking feeling in his gut. It wasn't anger. It was the uncomfortable, distinct feeling of being wrong. He saw the passion in Leo's posture, the raw talent that Leo had been hiding in plain sight. For the first time, Holloway realized he hadn't just underestimated a student. He had completely misjudged a human being. Leo could feel the energy in the room shifting. Even with his eyes closed, he could sense it. The air felt different. The tension wasn't aggressive anymore. It was supportive. He felt a wave of confidence wash over him, warmer than the stage lights. He knew he had them. He took a deep breath and launched into the final crescendo. His hands moved faster than ever, crossing over each other, dancing up and down the keyboard. The volume grew, filling the hall with a triumphant, soaring sound. It was loud, but not messy. Every note was clear, every emotion intentional. He poured everything he had left into these final measures, throwing his whole heart into the instrument. He wasn't the quiet kid anymore. He was a giant. He was powerful. He struck the final chords with both hands, a thunderous sound that seemed to shake the floorboards. And then he lifted his hands high off the keys, ending the song with a sudden, sharp silence. Leo sat there, his chest heaving, his hands suspended in the air. He didn't move. He kept his eyes closed for just a second longer, savoring the feeling of the vibration fading away. Lingering in the air like an echo, slowly he opened his eyes. He lowered his hands to his lap. He sat up straight. The bright lights were blinding again, and he couldn't see the faces of the crowd clearly, but he didn't need to. He could feel the silence that followed. It wasn't the bored silence of the beginning. It was a heavy, stunned silence. A silence where people were too shocked to speak. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs, wondering what would happen next. The silence that followed the final chord was heavy and deep. It stretched out for what felt like a lifetime to Leo. though in reality, it was only a few seconds. He sat on the bench, his hands resting in his lap, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His ears were ringing slightly from the intensity of the music. In the glare of the spotlight, the audience was just a black void, but he could feel the energy in the room. It had shifted completely. The restless boredom, the low hum of whispers, the clicking of pens, all of it was gone. The air felt still, waiting. Leo felt a sudden wave of panic crash over him. Asterisk, why aren't they clapping? He thought, his mind racing. Asterisk, did I mess up the ending? Did it sound bad? Was I too loud? The doubt that had plagued him for weeks came rushing back. He gripped the edges of the piano bench, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to stand up and run, but his legs felt like lead weights. He just sat there, staring at the keys, terrified to look up. Then, a single pair of hands started clapping. It was a slow, rhythmic clap, coming from the back of the auditorium. Within a second, another person joined in. Then another. Suddenly, the silence shattered. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. It started as a wave and grew into a thunderous noise that bounced off the walls and ceiling. People weren't just clapping. They were stomping their feet, whistling and shouting. Leo blinked, confused. He squinted into the lights, trying to see. As his eyes adjusted, he saw movement in the front row. People were standing up. First one person, then a whole group. The standing ovation started at the front and swept toward the back like a ripple in a pond. The entire auditorium was on its feet. The noise was deafening, a wall of sound that washed away his fear. He sat there for a moment longer, completely stunned. He looked out and saw faces he recognized, the popular girls, the athletes, the teachers, and they were all looking at him, but not with the pity or dismissal he was used to. They were looking at him with surprise, with respect, and with genuine admiration. He saw Mrs. Gable in the wings, wiping a tear from her eye and clapping her hands above her head. Slowly, Leo stood up. His legs felt shaky, like he had just run a marathon. He walked to the center of the stage, the piano behind him. He felt exposed under the bright lights. But for the first time in his life, he didn't want to hide. He looked out at the sea of people. He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he just gave a small, awkward wave. The crowd roared even louder. His eyes scanned the front row instinctively, searching for the one person he had been trying to prove wrong. He found Principal Holloway. The principal was standing. He wasn't clapping as wildly as the students, but he was clapping. He had a strange look on his face. His eyebrows were drawn together, and his mouth was set in a firm line. He wasn't smiling broadly, but he wasn't looking at his watch anymore. He was looking directly at Leo. Their eyes met across the distance. Leo saw something shift in the principal's expression. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of solemn acknowledgement. It was a look that said, "I was wrong." Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He gave a small, respectful nod toward the principal. Holloway nodded back, a slow, single dip of his chin. It wasn't an apology spoken out loud, but in that moment, it felt like enough. The validation that Leo had been starving for, that he thought he would never get, was finally there. He didn't need to be the star athlete or the popular kid. He just needed to be heard. Leo offered a humble bow. It wasn't a theatrical bow. It was just him bending forward slightly, trying to show his gratitude. The applause seemed to grow even louder at this gesture. He turned and walked back to the piano to pick up his sheet music. His hands were steady now. He folded the papers, closed the folder, and tucked it under his arm. As he walked off the stage, the noise followed him. He stepped into the wings, and the cool air of the backstage area hid his sweat-drenched face. As soon as he was out of the spotlight, the adrenaline that had been keeping him going began to fade. Leaving him feeling exhausted but light, he was immediately swarmed. Students from other acts rushed over to him. "Dude, that was insane," a guy from the rock band said, grabbing Leo's shoulder. "I didn't know you could play like that. That was so beautiful," one of the dancers said, her eyes wide. I almost started crying. Leo didn't know what to say. He just mumbled thanks and smiled a shy smile. He felt like he was floating. He wasn't the invisible boy anymore. He was the center of attention, and surprisingly, it didn't feel scary. It felt warm. Mrs. Gable came over and gave him a hug. "I told you, Leo," she whispered in his ear. "You have a gift. Thank you for sharing it." He squeezed his folder tight. He realized that he wasn't just holding music. He was holding a part of himself that he had finally let out. The fear that had defined his life for so long, the fear of being judged, being laughed at, of not being enough, had lost its power. He had faced the biggest crowd he could imagine, and he had conquered them. Not by being someone else, but by being truly himself. He walked toward the exit of the auditorium. Leaving the noise and excitement behind him, he wanted to be alone for a minute to process everything. He pushed open the metal side door and stepped out into the night air. It was dark outside. The parking lot lights were buzzing, illuminating the rows of cars. The air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stuffy heat of the stage. Leo took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh air. He looked up at the sky. There were a few stars visible above the school buildings. He thought about going back inside to join the reception, but he decided against it. He didn't need to stand around and hear people tell him he was good. He knew he was good. He felt it in his bones. Leo began the walk home. He didn't have his hoodie up to hide his face tonight. He walked with his head up, looking at the world around him. The streets looked different. The shadows didn't seem as threatening, and the distance didn't seem as far. He hummed a quiet melody to himself, the tune from the piece he had just played. He knew that tomorrow, things would go back to normal in some ways. He would still be the quiet kid in the back of the class. He would still wear his sweaters. But underneath that, something had changed permanently. He knew that if Principal Holloway or anyone else ever tried to make him feel small again, he wouldn't have to believe them. He had a voice now. It was a voice made of ivory and ebony, of rhythm and sound. And it was a voice that no one could ever take away from him. He put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the streetlights. His steps light and confident for the first time in his life. The night wasn't scary anymore. It was just a beautiful, quiet background for the music that was still playing in his heart.